Hello, welcome to the video. If you look at these three pictures, you might recognize one of them, you might not. Going from left to right and from earliest to most recent, the men are John Wycliffe, Jan Hus, and Martin Luther. It's only proper to start with an introduction. I'll give a brief introduction of these three men. Though Martin Luther perhaps does not need one, I'll introduce him too nonetheless. John Wycliffe was born around 1324 in or around the parish of Wycliffe in York, England. The name of the parish and his name matching up is no coincidence, since he lived in an era before hereditary last names were common. He took the name of his parish as his last name. As a young man, he attended university at Oxford, which was already a leading university in Europe. He earned a Doctor of Divinity from Oxford, which degree was exceedingly rare at that time, and eventually became a professor of divinity at Oxford. He wrote many treatises both in Latin and English. In the treatises that he is most well known for, he attacked both the corruptions of the church hierarchy and what he believed as false doctrines of the church. Before I get into his social effects besides his doctorate and professorship, I'd like to read off a couple excerpts from his treatises that he wrote. This is a quote from Wycliffe's treatise On the Last Age of the Church, which he wrote in 1356 in English, and it's more or less on the end times. Wycliffe had been at Oxford during the Black Death, and it reads, "I have seen that death, vengeance of sword, mischiefs unknown before, by which men these days shall be punished, shall fall for sin of priests. Men shall fall on them, and cast them out of their fat benefices. And they shall say, He came into his benefice by his kindred, these by covenant made before, he for his service, and these for money came into God's church. Then shall each such priest cry, Alas, alas, that no good spirit dwelled with me at my coming into God's church." This seems to be a translation from one of his Latin works published in the 1370s that was included in a few biographies of him. And it reads, "Though we had 100 popes, and all the friars in the world were turned into cardinals, yet ought we to trust more to the law of the gospel than all this multitude."
From saying such things in the medieval era, you would think that the church would have immediately shut down John Wycliffe. And the Pope did try, the church authorities did try, but John Wycliffe had several historical and political advantages. In fact, he had even won over some of the higher nobility and parliament. In addition, towards the end of his life, there was actually the schism where there were two rival popes. There was a pope at Avignon in France and a pope in Rome.
Another advantage that Wycliffe had was that he was based in England, which was sort of on the periphery of the known world at that time. With these advantages, Wycliffe was at one of the best historical moments to start a movement. And in fact, he did start a movement. His popularity did actually grow even after his death, to the point that it was ordered that his bones be dug up and thrown to the dunghill so that his supporters would be unable to venerate them. Nevertheless, he didn't have nearly the history-altering effect that Martin Luther would later have. Jan Hus was born around 1373, so about 11 years before the death of John Wycliffe, in the village of Husinec, which was then in Bohemia, but is now in the Czech Republic. Like John Wycliffe, his last name, Huss, comes from the village he was born in. Huss received a Bachelor and Masters of Arts as well as a Bachelor of Divinity from the University of Prague, and was also chosen as the rector of the university. Huss actually translated a number of Wycliffe's Latin works into Bohemian, Bohemian being the ancestor of the modern Czech language. Much like Wycliffe, he attacked the abuses of the clergy and what he believed as false doctrines of the church. Huss had similar advantages to Wycliffe, such as winning over the king of Bohemia, and the schism where there were multiple popes had gotten worse at the time of Huss. But that turned out to be his undoing. In 1409, there was elected a third pope, and Bohemia pledged itself to this third pope. And so Jan Hus was condemned as a heretic and burned at the stake. After Huss's execution, his teachings did remain popular in Bohemia, and in fact the Reformation did come early to Bohemia as a result of Jan Hus's teachings. However, his movement did not really reach beyond the borders of Bohemia, except in as much as it inspired the later reformer Martin Luther of Germany. Martin Luther was born in Eisleben on November 10th, 1483. Eisleben was then a part of the Holy Roman Empire, but is now in modern Germany. At the University of Wittenberg, Martin Luther, like John Wycliffe, would obtain a Doctor of Divinity and become a professor. It is useful to compare the fall of Huss and the rise of Luther, since both were related to a specific abuse of the clergy, namely the selling of indulgences. The fall of Huss, like I said before, was related to the papal schism. Because there were 3 rival popes, each pope could only claim jurisdiction over a smaller number of countries. Therefore, the popes became more aggressive as far as selling indulgences and other such to gain worldly money were concerned. In 1412, the Pope of Pisa, that is, the 3rd pope that Bohemia had pledged allegiance to, began selling indulgences to finance his war against the Pope of Rome. Huss's opposition to this indulgence selling was the last straw which ultimately led to his downfall. Similarly, in 1517, the Pope of Rome, being the only pope after the conclusion of the papal schism a mere handful of years after the death of Jan Hus, was selling indulgences in Germany. In opposition to this selling of indulgences, Martin Luther wrote the 95 Theses that are today considered the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. The publication of his 95 Theses relatively quickly turned Martin Luther from a relatively obscure professor at a relatively new university to one of the most well-known opponents of the Pope. Luther's reform movement in opposition to the papacy grew larger in his lifetime than either Wycliffe's or Huss's after their deaths. Luther was spared the fiery fate of Huss partially through the protection of the Prince Elector of Saxony. However, the Catholic Church had, as I mentioned, managed to resolve the papal schism, which meant the Pope was stronger than ever. However, Martin Luther had a technical advantage that neither Wycliffe or Huss had: the printing press affiliated with the University of Wittenberg. Wycliffe and Huss were active prior to the development of the printing press, so them and their supporters had only access to quill or reed pens, like which I'm going to show right now, to copy their works with. The preparation of a Featherbook pen would take around 5 minutes or so for somebody that knew what they were doing. They would first need to trim off the very end where the quill is very skinny. Then they would need to make a large scooping cut here, and then trim each side. They would need to clean up the cuts a little bit. They would then score along the middle to help the ink flow, and then trim off the very end so they would have a flat tip. And then they would chop off the end of the feather here and trim off the actual fletching of the feather. And as for writing, you probably need to dip into the ink maybe once every sentence or so. I probably dipped into ink here. Yeah, but, I don't really, not that experienced with writing day in or day out. Especially with the fancy lettering that people expected during the medieval era. It took scribes could maybe write a few pages a day. Now I will use some footage that I poached from the BBC series Connections and the YouTube channel of Professor Troshkovsky of the University of Regina to demonstrate how the printing press worked.
So he took a punch and he carved a letter on the end of it, and using the punch, he punched that letter into a soft copper bar. Then he designed a mold in 2 bits so that it comes apart. You put the mold together like that. You slide into the mold the letter you want to make, any letter. Close it tight with a big spring. Turn it over. And then, very, very carefully, you put molten lead alloy into the mold like this. Leave it for just a few seconds, and then you break the mold, and the letter is there, ready to print with.
The printer would then lay out the cast letters into a composing stick and lay them out and lock them into a form for printing.
As for the printing itself, well, that was a bit of a cinch. This press was just an adaptation of a linen press that had been around for centuries, as had the ink and the paper.
The development of printing made such a night and day difference to the effort required to produce each individual copy of a book that the very first English printer, William Caxton, in 1475, in one of the prologues to his translation, wrote, "In the writing, my pen is worn, my hand weary and not steadfast, my eyes dimmed with overmuch looking on the white paper. Therefore I have practised and learned at my great charge and dispense to ordain this said book in print after the manner and form as ye may here see. For all the books thus imprinted, as ye here see, were begun in one day and also finished in one." In short, the printing press was the one advantage that allowed the Reformation of Martin Luther to have a much greater reach and success than either the Reformation of John Wycliffe or of Jan Hus.